My mom sabotaged my life for herself. Now she's watching me rise without her. I'm 28 now, and I haven't spoken to my mother Linda in over 6 years. She raised me alone in a quiet Michigan town after my father supposedly walked out when I was 5. For most of my life, I believed he was just a deadbeat who didn't care. At least, that's how Linda described him. A selfish loser who bailed without a trace. She never gave me a name, never showed me a photo, nothing. He was always just your father. Linda worked long shifts as a nurse, always tired, always stressed. She wasn't physically abusive, but emotionally, cold, distant, and dismissive. She'd say things like, "Be grateful I come home at all, so I stopped asking for anything." She never taught me how to cook, drive, or do basic life stuff. I figured most of it out through YouTube or from friends at school. School became my refuge. I loved the structure, the expectations, the predictability, especially in science class. In 8th grade, I fell in love with environmental science, even staying after school to help clean up and ask questions. But any hint that I wanted to pursue it further was shut down immediately. When I tried to join robotics club, my name mysteriously vanished from the list. Later, I found out someone called to have it removed. I didn't need to ask who it was. By high school, Linda had already made up her mind about my future. She pushed me into a nursing assistant program, saying college was a scam and I wasn't smart enough for engineering. She even laughed when I told her my dream. Not a chuckle, a full, mocking laugh. Even though Linda insisted I stay home to save money, she charged me $900 a month for rent, on top of splitting groceries and even household stuff like toilet paper and light bulbs. At the time, I thought I was contributing. Later, I realized I was just covering her debts. The only person who really saw what was happening was Mason, a close friend I'd known since high school. He had this quiet way of checking in, of noticing when I was sinking, even if I didn't say a word. He kept telling me I was more than just a nurse's aide, more than someone stuck in scrubs changing sheets and bedpans. One day, he handed me a folded community college schedule. 3 words were underlined in pen. "You can start here." So I did, in secret. I picked one class, Intro to Environmental Systems, and paid out of pocket. I'd go straight from a long shift at the hospital to a campus across town, completely wiped out. But somehow, I felt alive for the first time in years. When Linda eventually found out about the class, she completely lost it. She called me selfish, ungrateful, reckless, said I was throwing my life away. When I didn't back down, she kicked me out of the house with barely any warning. I was 22. I crashed on Mason's couch at first, then we scraped together enough to rent a tiny apartment. The ceiling had water stains, the oven was barely functional, and the place always smelled faintly like mildew. But it was mine. I kept grinding, full-time at the hospital during the day, college classes at night. Slept when I could, stretched every dollar, and taught myself how to fix things around the apartment because we couldn't afford a handyman. Linda went silent. No calls, no birthday text. Not even a congrats when I finished my associate's degree. It was like I'd been erased. But I kept going. I transferred to a 4-year university, kept working, kept studying, and at 26, I walked across that stage with a degree in environmental engineering. It was the first time I truly felt like I was building a life of my own. One she hadn't picked for me. Out of nowhere, I got a call from an unfamiliar number during lunch at work. I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again. Something told me to pick up. The woman on the line introduced herself as Karen. She said she was married to a man named Daniel. The name didn't mean anything to me at first, until she said, "He was your father." I thought it had to be a scam. I asked how she got my number. She told me Daniel had hired a private investigator to find me, but he got sick before he could reach out. Cancer. Fast and unforgiving. He passed away 3 months earlier. Karen had found the investigator's file among his things. She didn't want his story to die with him. So she called me. We agreed to meet at a small cafe near my apartment. She was already waiting when I arrived, sitting at a table with a cardboard box and a folder beside her. Without hesitation, she opened the folder. Inside was a stack of envelopes. Every single one addressed to me, each one stamped with "returned to sender" or "refused." Letters, birthday cards, photos of me as a baby. Things I'd never seen. And then she said something that made the room spin. Daniel had been trying to reach me every year. Writing, sending gifts, always getting blocked. I hadn't been abandoned. I had been kept from him. Karen explained that Daniel had spent 2 years in prison when I was little, for a non-violent offense. She didn't go into details, and honestly, I didn't need them. What mattered was what came after. When he got out, he tried over and over to reconnect with me. He emailed Linda, begged for just one phone call. He sent letters, gifts, even reached out to schools, but Linda made sure none of it ever got to me. That night, I sat on my living room floor with the box from Karen and couldn't stop thinking about what else had been kept from me. I started tearing through the storage bins I'd brought from Linda's house years ago. There was this old dresser I had dragged out of my childhood bedroom when I moved. I pulled out the bottom drawer and found something wedged behind the back panel, an entire stack of envelopes, dusty and yellowing. Some were postmarked from Florida, others from Illinois, all addressed to me. Not a single one had been opened. It hit me like a gut punch. Linda hadn't just lied. She had deliberately erased him. Every chance I had to know my father had been stuffed into hiding places and left to rot. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became. Linda didn't just lie. She orchestrated everything. She didn't want me to just forget my father. She wanted to erase the very idea of him. Every unopened letter, every discarded gift, every moment of silence I'd spent wondering why he never cared. It was all a lie she'd built and maintained for years. It wasn't just about Daniel. She had sabotaged so many other things, too. The scholarship flyer that vanished before I could apply, the email that never reached me, the time she took my phone for months after grounding me for something I didn't even do. I sat there, surrounded by years of lost connections, and I grabbed a legal pad. I started listing each year of my life, not by the memories I had, but by what I now knew was missing. Scholarships, programs, messages, mail, a father's presence. I was no longer just grieving a relationship. I was digging through the wreckage of an entire life rewritten behind my back, and now I was determined to rebuild it, piece by piece, with Linda watching every step of the way. I needed more than just letters. I needed confirmation, proof that I wasn't imagining any of this. So I started tracking down people from my childhood, anyone who might have seen something. First, I drove back to my old neighborhood and spotted Mrs. Noren, the woman who lived next door to us for years. She looked older, but the moment I called her name, she lit up and invited me inside like no time had passed. I asked her if she remembered anyone ever showing up at our house when I was little. She nodded right away, said there was a man who came around the same time every year. He never knocked, never stayed long, just left something in the mailbox and walked away with a sad look on his face. He had tattoos, but he didn't seem dangerous, just heartbroken. She once asked Linda who he was, and all Linda said was, "No one important." Next, I tracked down Miss Avery, the librarian from my middle school. She was retired, but still volunteering downtown. When I asked if she remembered me, she smiled and said, "Of course." Then I asked if she had ever seen my dad. Her face changed. She told me yes. He'd shown up to one of my middle school science fairs. He brought a small gift bag that matched one of the envelopes I'd found hidden in the dresser. He'd been there, watching, trying. And every time, Linda was right behind, slamming the door shut before I ever knew it was even open. I wasn't done. The more I looked, the more I found. I went back to my old high school and asked if I could review any archived records tied to my time there. The school counselor was new but understanding. She handed me a binder filled with old academic notes. I flipped through the pages slowly, and there it was. Clear as day. A note from my sophomore year math teacher: student qualifies for district-level gifted math program. Transportation unconfirmed. Then, right below it, another line added, weeks later. Pulled from workshop, parent cited scheduling concerns. I remembered how excited I'd been about that program, and how suddenly it just disappeared. Linda had shut it down, like she always did. I wasn't just being forgotten, I was being held back on purpose. I then went to the local library and asked Mrs. Elser, the librarian, if they kept scholarship listings from previous years. She took me to a back room where dusty old ledgers were shelved. She flipped to the year I graduated. My name was there under a local Science Foundation grant, $3,000. But next to it, in tiny handwriting, were 5 crushing words. Family declined on her behalf. My hands were shaking. How many chances had I lost without ever knowing they were mine to begin with? It was becoming impossible to ignore. This wasn't negligence. It was sabotage. I couldn't stop thinking about the return address on one of the old letters. It was from a small town 3 hours south, near the state line. I decided to go. I packed the box of letters, the timeline I'd started, and drove straight there. I found the house. The mailbox was rusted, the siding faded, but the address matched. I knocked. A woman in her 40s answered. When I explained who I was and why I was there, she didn't seem surprised. She told me she had bought the place from Daniel about 8 years ago. He left in a hurry, she said, but there was one box he'd forgotten in the attic. She found it tucked into a crawl space and kept it, thinking it might be important someday. Inside that box were pieces of him, of me. Letters, journals, and a small notebook where he documented every time he tried to see me. One entry said he had waited outside a bookstore near my town, just hoping to catch a glimpse. He'd seen me walk out with a bag of books and wrote that I looked older, taller. He didn't get out of the car. He didn't want Linda to call the police again. The next morning, I visited the local mechanic shop, one of the few in town. The guy behind the counter, Jared, knew Daniel right away. Said he used to work there, always saving money and picking up extra shifts. He told Jared once that he was putting money aside for his daughter. Before I left, Jared handed me something he'd been holding onto, Daniel's old work laptop. He said it had been left behind in his locker. I opened it that night, and it was like reading a roadmap of everything I should have had. Spreadsheets comparing colleges, deadlines for scholarships, margin notes like ask counselor if GPA minimum changed, and look into bus routes for campus access. He had done everything Linda claimed was too complicated for me to figure out on my own. But he had been trying to figure it out for me all along, and now I had the proof. Something had been nagging at me. Those weird spam calls I used to get about unpaid bills. I always thought they were scams. But after everything with Linda, I wasn't so sure anymore. I pulled my credit report that night and went line by line. Most of it looked fine, until I found them 2 credit cards opened when I was 19, still living under Linda's roof. I had no memory of applying for them. The charges weren't wild, just little things. Groceries, utility payments, gas, just enough to stay under the radar, just enough to not raise red flags. But it wasn't me, it was her. I didn't call to confront her. I didn't need to yell or demand answers. The silence said everything. Instead, I made a quiet, powerful decision. I started packing. I canceled my storage unit, cleared out the last of the things I'd kept just in case, and booked a place far enough away that Linda would never find me. No goodbye, no forwarding address, no explanation. I told only the people I trusted, turned off my real phone for the night, and drove. I wasn't running, I was reclaiming, rebuilding. Every step forward now would be mine, and if Linda ever heard about my success, it would be from the outside, looking in. Exactly where she chose to place herself, because I wasn't just walking away. I was making sure she had no part in the life I was finally ready to live.